single arbitrary thing. Didn't stick that tiny inconsequential key into that tiny inconsequential lock. But we all know that was just the beginning, a test. She failed and lived to tell the tale, as I have. But even if she'd passed, even if she'd listened, there'd have been some other request, a little larger, a little stranger, and if she'd kept going, kept allowing herself to be trained like a corset fanatic, pinching her waist smaller and smaller, there'd have been a scene where Bluebeard danced around with the rotting corpses of his past wives clasped in his arms, and the newest wife would have sat there mutely, suppressing growing horror, swallowing the egg of vomit that bobbed behind her breastbone. And then later, another scene in which he did unspeakable things to the bodies. Women, they'd once been women, and she just stared dead into the middle distance, seeking some purgatory where she could live forever. Some scholars believe that Bluebeard's Bluebeard is a symbol of his supernatural nature, easier to accept than being brought to heel by a simple man. But isn't that the joke? He can be simple, and he doesn't have to be a man. Because she hadn't blinked at the key and its conditions, hadn't paused when he told her footfalls were too heavy for his liking, hadn't protested when he fucked her while she wept, hadn't declined when he suggested she stop speaking, hadn't said a word when he left bruises on her arms, hadn't scolded him for speaking to her like she was a dog or a child, hadn't run screaming down the path from the castle into the nearest village, pleading with someone to help, it made logical sense that she sat there and watched him spinning around the body of wife number 4, its decaying head flopping backward on a hinge of flesh. This is how you are toughened, the newest wife reasoned. This is where the tenacity of love is practiced, its tensile strength, its durability. You are being tested, and you are passing the test. Sweet girl, sweet self, look how good you are, look how loyal, look how loved.
Das Traumhaus als Blaubart. Blaubarts größte Lüge war, dass es nur eine Regel gäbe. Seine neueste Frau könnte tun und lassen, was sie wolle. Ganz egal, solange es nicht diese eine einzige willkürliche Sache sei, solange sie nicht diesen winzigen, unwichtigen Schlüssel in dieses winzige, unwichtige Schloss stecke. Aber wir alle wissen, das war nur der Anfang. Es war ein Test. Sie fiel durch und überlebte, um ihre Geschichte zu erzählen, wie ich. Aber selbst wenn sie bestanden hätte, selbst wenn sie gehorcht hätte, hätte es eine nächste Bedingung gegeben, die ein bisschen umfangreicher, ein bisschen seltsamer gewesen wäre und wenn sie weitergemacht hätte, sich immer weiter hätte einschränken lassen, wie eine Korsettfanatikerin, die ihre Taille immer schmaler schnürt. Hätte es irgendwann eine Szene gegeben, in der Blaubart mit den vor sich hinrottenden Leichen seiner früheren Frauen im Arm herumtanzt, während sie stumm daneben sitzt, gegen ihr wachsendes Grauen ankämpft und den hinter ihrem Brustbein aufsteigenden Kotzpfropf herunterzuschlucken versucht. Und später eine weitere Szene, in der er Unaussprechliches mit den Leichen anstellt, mit den Frauen. Schließlich sind sie mal Frauen gewesen und sie ins Leere starrt, sich auf immer und ewig in ein stummes Fegefeuer wünscht. Manche Gelehrten glauben, Blaubarts blauer Bart sei ein Symbol für seine übernatürliche Herkunft. Das ist leichter hinnehmbar, als von einem gewöhnlichen Mann gefügig gemacht zu werden. Aber ist das nicht gerade der Witz? Er kann durchaus gewöhnlich sein und noch nicht mal ein Mann muss er sein. Weil sie beim Schlüssel und den daran gebundenen Bedingungen nicht mit der Wimper gezuckt hatte, nicht stutzte, als er sagte, ihre Schritte seien ihm zu schwer, nicht aufbegehrte, als er es mit ihr trieb, während sie weinte, nicht widersprach, als er ihr nahelegte, mit dem Sprechen aufzuhören, kein Wort sagte, als er blaue Flecken auf ihrem Arm hinterließ, ihn nicht tadelte, als er mit ihr wie mit einem Hund oder mit einem Kind sprach, nicht schreiend vom Schloss ins nächste Dorf rannte und dort jemanden um Hilfe anflehte. War es nur logisch, dass sie daneben saß und zuschaute, wie er die Leiche von Ehefrau Nummer 4 herumwirbelte und ihr vermodernder Kopf an einem letzten Strang Fleisch nach hinten klappte. Das härtet ab, dachte die neueste Frau bei sich. Das stärkt das Band der Liebe, seine Reißfestigkeit, seine Widerstandsfähigkeit. Du wirst getestet und du bestehst den Test. Liebes Mädchen, liebes Ich, guck mal, wie gut du bist. Guck, wie loyal. Guck, wie du geliebt wirst. Das Traumhaus als Gelüst. Recht früh machst du einen Fehler, aber das weißt du zu diesem Zeitpunkt noch nicht. Du gibst zu, dass du andauernd kleine Schwärmereien für irgendwen entwickelst. Nichts, was du je ausleben würdest. Du findest einfach viele Leute attraktiv und tust dein Möglichstes, dich mit klugen, lustigen Köpfen zu umgeben. Das Ergebnis ist ein schnulzig angenehmes Zwischending aus Philia und Eros. So bist du schon, solange du denken kannst. Diese Eigenart deines Charakters hast du immer nur als genau das wahrgenommen. Eine Eigenart eben. Und sie lacht und sagt, das fände sie charmant. Im Laufe eurer Beziehung wird sie dich beschuldigen, mit folgenden Leuten ins Bett zu gehen, mit ihnen im Bett gewesen zu sein oder mit ihnen ins Bett gehen zu wollen. Deine Mitbewohner, der Freundin deines Mitbewohners, Dutzenden deiner Freundinnen und Freunde, dem Clarion-Jahrgang, den du noch gar nicht kennengelernt hast, einem Dutzend ihrer Freundinnen und Freunde, nicht wenigen ihrer Mitstudierenden an der Indiana, ihrer Ex-Freundin, ihrem Ex-Freund, deinen Ex-Freunden, etlichen deiner Dozentinnen und Dozenten, der Leiterin deines Studiengangs, etlichen deiner Studierenden, einem deiner Ärzte und, der vielleicht abwegigste Moment dieser Übung, ihrem Vater. Außerdem mit einem ellenlangen Katalog von Wildfremden, Leuten in der U-Bahn und in Cafés, Bedienungen im Restaurant, Verkaufs- und Kassenpersonal im Supermarkt, Bibliothekarinnen, Kartenabreißern, Hausmeistern, Museumsbesucherinnen und Schlafenden am Strand. Das Problem ist, dass Abstreiten in ihren Ohren wie ein Geständnis klingt, womit die Beweislast dir aufgezwungen wird. Um ihr zu zeigen, dass du nicht mit diesen Leuten im Bett warst, wirst du eine wahre Meisterin darin, dein Handy zu durchforsten, um Beweise dafür zu liefern, dass du mit niemandem Kontakt hattest. Du hörst auf, über die vielversprechende Studentin in einem deiner Seminare zu sprechen, weil sie sich auf die Idee versteift, dass du in eine 19-Jährige verknallt bist, die gerade erst gelernt hat, wie man das Gleichgewicht zwischen Erzählerbericht und szenischem Schreiben hält. Irgendwann streicht sie dir gerade über die Klitoris und du schließt genüsslich die Augen, als sie plötzlich dein Gesicht packt und es zu sich dreht. Sie kommt dir so nah, dass du etwas Saures in ihrem Atem riechen kannst. An wen denkst du? Sagt sie. Es ist wie eine Frage formuliert, ist aber keine. Dein Mund bewegt sich, aber es kommt nichts raus und sie packt deinen Kiefer noch ein bisschen fester. Guck mich an, wenn ich dich ficke, sagt sie. Du tust so, als würdest du kommen. Das Traumhaus als Naturkatastrophe. Ich habe schlimmes Sodbrennen. Das liegt am Sertralin, das zwar meine Angstzustände mildert, aber auch einen Haufen schlimmer Nebenwirkungen mit sich bringt, wie eine gute Freundin, die ihre schlechtere Hälfte immer dabei hat. Manchmal nehme ich abends meine Medikamente und habe nach ein paar Minuten das Gefühl, mir würde ein glühender Schnürhaken in die Speiseröhre gerammt. Dann kaue ich Säureblocker und gehe ins Bad. Oft muss ich mich vor Schmerzen oder wegen der heftigen Neutralisationsreaktion übergeben. Ich werde praktisch zum Lieblingsexperiment jedes Schulkinds. Wenn ich über der Toilette hänge, stelle ich mir oft vor, dass mein Herz ein Vulkan ist, wie in dem Zitat von Khalil Gibran. Es ist kitschig, aber irgendwie sprach es mich an, rührte an den losen tektonischen Platten in meinem Innern. Deshalb schrieb ich es auf ein Post-it und klebte es mir auf den Schreibtisch. Wenn dein Herz ein Vulkan ist, wie sollen in deinen Händen dann Blumen blühen? Dort klebte es, bis ich bei der Arbeit an diesem Buch einmal einen schlechten Tag hatte und sich plötzlich in jeder Faser meines Körpers ein glühender Hass regte, woraufhin ich es zerknüllte und wegwarf. Erinnerst du dich an Volcano, diesen völlig abstrusen Film mit Tommy Lee Jones? Weißt du noch, wie sie den Vulkanausbruch mitten in Los Angeles stoppen? Wie sie die Lava mit Straßensperren aus Beton und mit Feuerwehrschläuchen aufhalten und dann ins Meer umleiten und alles ist gut? Liebe Leserin, lieber Leser, so läuft das mit Lava nicht. Das weiß doch jedes Kind. In Wirklichkeit läuft es nämlich folgendermaßen. Ich warte, dass meine Wut sich legt, aber das tut sie nicht. Ich warte, dass jemand meine Wut ins Meer ableitet, aber das kann niemand. Mein Herz ist eher Dantes Peak in Dantes Peak. Meine Wut löst Großmütter in Säureseen auf, löscht malerische Örtchen im pazifischen Nordwesten aus und verstopft Flugzeugtriebwerke mit ihrer Asche. Lava fließt meine Flanken hinab. Du hättest auf die Wissenschaft hören sollen. Du hättest früher evakuieren sollen. Gut, zurück zu Khalil Gibran. Ich weiß, was er meint, aber nicht mal rhetorisch geht das Ganze auf. Tatsächlich siedeln sich Menschen nämlich besonders gern in der Nähe von Vulkanen an, weil die Asche den Boden dort so nährstoffreich macht. In der Gefahrenzone werden die Früchte süßer, die Feldpflanzen größer, die Blumen bunter, wird die Ernte reicher. In Wahrheit ist das Leben nirgends besser als im Schatten eines malerischen, brodelnden Bergs.
You got an impression of how the book is working, and for us as readers, we hear the story. We experience the domestic violence, we experience the cross boundaries, the taboo breaking, but the short form helps somehow to not get too involved into it. And I thought, was that something for you as a writer, but also having a reader in mind, that you wanted to emphasize maybe or help, that we don't have to really dive into how it felt, just experiences part by part, just a little, and that we always can put the book aside and reflect on it and breathe and be safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I realized fairly early on that the book is so intense, like there's so many things happening that you need breaks and you need a kind of levity or like a kind of air or like effervescence. And a lot of the games that are being sort of played, formally speaking, give you a little bit of breathing room or a little bit of play. And so, I don't know, like, even when I was writing them, like I remember thinking, because writing them was so hard and it was like really painful and difficult, but if I got to do something kind of fun, like formally speaking, then it gave me a little bit of space, I think, for my own sanity. And so I like to think of that effect sort of transfers over to the reader as well, where you can take breaks easily, you can sort of pause, there's, there are certain sections that are longer than others and more intense than others. And I think when I read from them, people do feel very it's like falling into a little pit. But it's certainly, I think, being able to sort of move quickly through the book does permit a kind of movement that is, I guess, helpful for the reader and was helpful for me as a writer as well.
On the one hand, it was helpful and was like breathing, pauses to breathe. But on the other hand, they are like these short chapters are some kind of disruptive moments. Do you think it was necessary to, or is it something you think about as a writer to maybe, let the reader feel lost or provoke them a little bit?
Yes. I mean, I did want parts of the book to feel hostile, I guess, which is why I wrote the Choose Your Own Adventure section. I'd had this idea early on about, I had like a notebook where I was keeping notes, and I wrote "gaslight the reader?" ? And was sort of trying to imagine various ways to, render part of the text hostile to the reader in a way that feels true to sort of the spirit of the book, or like what the book is trying to sort of reproduce or explain. And I sort of tried various ways, and I hadn't quite figured out what I wanted. And then I thought to myself, what better form to illustrate how choice is an illusion, like in an abusive relationship, than a Choose Your Own Adventure, which like ostensibly gives you narrative choice where you can make decisions, but ultimately you're just stuck, like you're trapped, you're going in circles, like you can't really get out. And every choice is being predetermined for you by somebody else, by the author. And so ultimately that became like a way to create that effect where the reader was supposed to not feel kind of entirely safe. And it's interesting because I wrote it, like I said, I wrote it last, or was one of the last things I wrote. And I get asked about that section more than any other section in the book, like by far. And so clearly it like had its intended impact. It did what I wanted it to do. So.
One thing, but it has a playful element as well, and another playful element in the book are the motive index, the Thompson motive index. I don't know if you read that out loud. There are footnotes in the book. I don't know how many footnotes are in the book. I don't know if you have counted, but there are many. What is it about the motive index of folk literature that made it their way to the book?
So I was interested in writing about fairy tales. As a writer, I'm very interested in urban legends, folk tales, fairy tales. It's like a thing that I return to very often. And I had written the Bluebeard part, which we heard, and I had also written this other section about sort of silence in fairy tales. So fairy tales where tongues are cut out or sort of spells are put on you, you have to remain silent. And so that became something as well. And I was sort of doing some research and looking for other fairy tales about silence, and was doing so by trying to look through these sort of various indices about fairy, which there are many. Many sort of scholars of fairy tales have tried to create these organizational systems for sort of folk tales across, various time periods and nationalities and languages and things like that. And so I just happened upon this one, which was the one that I ended up using, the Thompson Folk Motif Index, which was like 1,000 pages long, like this huge, I was reading a digital version, but I guess in person, it's like many, many volumes. And they were just so incredibly detailed in this way that I found very funny and interesting. And also I think I was thinking a lot about how, like, the thing about folktales is that they're stories that unite us, like, across nationalities, across time, across languages, like, we have all these shared sort of folktales and fairy tales, and like, they create this sort of universal storytelling landscape that we all can access in a certain way. And so I was trying to write a book about like a thing that you don't hear about, and I was like, what better way to sort of try to like tie that into these universal stories than like kind of put it into the framework of these tropes and motifs. And again, it was like kind of a fun thing to do. It was like, having to go through and sort of figure out like, oh, what are some little like footnotes that I could find that'll, fit or whatever. So yeah, it was like, but it ended up being, I think, another part of the book that was like a little bit of an after, like it wasn't like from the beginning I hadn't thought that I was going to do it, but it ended up being really fun and people asked me about it a lot. And so I'm like, oh, okay. So it clearly spoke to people on some level.
I just wondered while reading if it is it was real, but it is, yeah.
It is, yeah.
You mentioned research, and you said in the beginning the book isn't only you writing about your own experiences, but you researched a lot about your reference to pop culture, to fairy tales. I already said that, but also legal papers and case histories. How did you research? How did you start? How did you get into it? And what were difficulties you had to face?
Yeah. Well, the hardest part was that I am not an academic or historian by practice or by trade. So I was very much doing a thing that I was not super familiar with. Like, that is not a piece of my practice usually. And so that was the first hard thing, was I was like, how do you even begin? And then, of course, the second hardest thing is that, you know, these are stories that are sort of hard to find. You know, like I was looking at, you know, I went to the Herstory Archives in New York, and I was sort of digging around but, you know, and I would like I remember like talking to this one woman in my community and saying, you know, hey, I'm looking for like this queer publication. Like, I've seen references to this lesbian publication from the 80s, but I can't seem to find it. And she was like, oh, like, I think Susan has those in her basement. Like, you should call Susan, you know, just like, because we know we don't value queer history in the way that we should. And so you end up with like entire runs of periodicals in Susan's basement, you know, and not like in an archive at a university or, you know, wherever they should be. And so there was just a lot of like digging and trying to figure things out, and like accessing sort of stuff that was hard to find. And then also, you know, I mean, part of the process was also trying to figure out like, what is the narrative, right? Like the thing that kind of makes it all come together. And I remember having this moment where I sort of realized like, oh, this must be how, you know, a historian feels when like I had read enough material that I had sort of figured out the narrative of like, what was the conversation about queer domestic violence in the lesbian community in the United States between 1980 and 2010? Which is like super specific. Like, it's like how historians are like, I study like one day of one battle, like in one war, you know, it's like, you know, it's like this incredibly specific thing, but it gave me this sense of like, I began to understand like all the things I talk about in the book about, you know, lesbian utopia and the way that this idea has sort of broken us a little bit, and talking about how queerness degenders people and so takes away people's believed capacity for violence, like and it was exhausting, you know, it was exhausting and also just very sad. Like I was just, you know, sitting down all day and just reading horrible stories about like women talking about what had happened to them, and it was just really awful and heartbreaking. So, yeah.
At one point in the book, you write most types of domestic abuse are completely legal, and I guess that was some kind of a challenge for you researching that from a legal point of view. Some cases weren't considered abuse. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with that?
Well, right, because like I did find a lot of interesting information in legal papers. Like the lawyers love a footnote, and I did a lot of reading about, you know, it was a lot of lawyers, you know, sort of saying like, the craziest thing happened. There was a battering case, but it was like two women. Wild, you know, and like a lawyer trying to sort of work through what this looked like or why, you know, why it's important. But then, yeah, sort of the hard thing was even all those legal examples that I found, they were all about physical abuse. They were all about hitting and black eyes and, you know, being beaten or someone being killed. And it's hard because like, right, like, you know, the way that we think about abuse is so, we think about it in this very black and white way. We think about it as this very physical thing. But of course, like abuse is this like very sort of wide ranging set of behaviors, many of which are completely legal or like have no, like there's no legal recourse for somebody. You know, and I mean, rightly or wrongly, like I'm like I don't believe in the police state. Like I don't believe in prisons. So like, I'm not saying they should be illegal, but like, there's just not a framework to talk about them outside of the sort of the legal system. And so, and it's funny to me because, you know, I talk in the book about Gaslight, like the 1944 film with Ingrid Bergman, which is like where we get this term gaslight from. And it's like probably the most famous, one of, if not the most famous sort of cultural examples of domestic violence. Like it is this classic film that we've like derived this like concept from. And like, he doesn't do anything illegal to her. Like, he does do illegal things, like he is a murderer, like outside of her, but like he doesn't do anything to her that he could be arrested for. You know, he's trying to make her go crazy, and he's like, you know, it's awful, and you watch it and it's like, oh, he's not actually breaking any laws, you know. And I think it's interesting that we sort of on some level understand this idea but we really struggle, even when it comes to stuff like, I don't know how it's been in Germany, but like in the US, sort of Me Too conversation is very binary. Like, it's like, well, was somebody raped? Like, did like an illegal thing happen? And if not, who cares? And it's like, well, there's like a wide range of things that can happen between something illegal or like rape and like nothing. Like, there's like a lot, And so I feel like it just became this way of, like, I was trying to sort of dig through and figure out, like, how do you talk about these spaces that are like, that we don't like to define, or we struggle to define and understand because they exist outside of like the government, the police, the legal framework. So yeah, that also was a thing that I had not really thought about exactly before. And then once I'd done enough research, I was like, oh, this is a whole piece of the puzzle.
When you're not aware when abuse starts, you don't know. And I wondered if that's some question you found an answer to while writing or while researching, or if you even cared about the question, where did it all start? Because it resembles so beautifully in your book, because we have various beginnings. In some way, and did you find an answer to it for you?
I think you're right that there are different answers. I think probably the thing that kind of came to me over and over while working on the book was simply the idea that there was so much that I didn't know. I spent so much time sitting with the reality of this situation, the reality of what had happened, the reality of this person that I was. And there are still a lot of unanswered questions, like I talk in the, I remember like writing the sections in which are sort of maybe physically most scary parts. And like the question of like, and my ex claims to have no memory of them. Like, she would say, I don't remember that happening. And like, I don't know if that's true or not. I still don't know. I will never know. I will die not knowing. And I think a lot of what writing the book was about was me trying to come to terms with the fact that there would be forever questions that I would have, or like, does she know or does she not know? Like, is she really aware of this or is she not aware of this? I don't know, and I'll never know. And it was really hard because I think on some level, maybe I expected to like, it's like, a choose your adventure. It's like you get to the end and you're like, aha, there's like something at the end. There's like a treasure at the end of the map, and I've figured it out. I've dug it up. I found it. But like, that's not how it works, And I think that was actually really, I don't think I realized I was having that thought, but then at some point I was like, oh, there are just so many things I will never know the answer to. Even while spending years trying to put this book together. So I don't know, that was like very strange, I guess, and sad. But
in some way, writing this book was maybe putting an end to it in some way. I mean, it's always with writing about abuse or pain. If the story is finished, it's over. You can put it aside. So maybe maybe in some way it could have been put an end to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, sorry. I was going to say, I think one of the hardest things about nonfiction or personal nonfiction is that there is no ending, right? Like, I'm still alive, I'm still alive. I'm still living my life. Like, the story is continuous. And like, at some point your publisher is like, give me the book, please. Like, you need to be done. Like, there needs to be an ending. And I sort of write about this at the end where it's like, there is no real ending. There is simply, I decide to stop somewhere, and that's kind of the end of that. Which is also like weirdly unsatisfying, like in a very strange way, but is just the reality of it. And I think, again, like I'm a fiction writer. I'm used to universes that I am the god of, and I can say when the story ends or doesn't end. And so it's very weird to be like, the story goes on, but I have to stop.
About how you will never know some things, like if your ex really doesn't remember. It's really it's somehow attached to the research as well, because some things we will never know because there are blank spaces. You talk about the archive in your book. You reflect on archives and the violence of the archive. And I have a friend who doesn't like to talk about firsts because you never know which stories have been erased. So how did you deal with that?
Yeah. Right. I mean, this was sort of like, again, became like the central framework or like academic framework, I guess, for the book, which is this idea of, archival silence or the violence of the archive, spaces and stories that we don't even know what we don't know, that like, and I think that there's something very, I mean, it's scary and it's sad, and and I think it's scary also in the sense that you can also see how these ideas play out in real life. Like, actually, I guess this would be mostly appropriate for this audience, but like, there's a thing that happens a lot where people will say, oh, gay people, trans people, that's new. Like, that's like a new fad. And it's like, no, like we were researching like queer history and queer science, like, and there was like an archive in Germany that like the Nazis burned to the ground that was like trans history and queer history and all this stuff. And like that was like a part, like that was a archive that literally existed that was literally destroyed, right? And then you think about all the stories that don't end up on paper, that don't end up in these archives, even if the archives do survive. Or you think about self-censorship or like people not being able to talk about what they're experiencing or talk about, their lives. And you just end up with these like massive holes, right? And it's sort of hard to know what to do with them because it's like, on one hand, people always get very defensive, like, especially if you say things like, oh, that historical figure may have been queer or like may have been trans, and people will sort of posit this idea. And people get very defensive. They're like, you can't say that if they didn't say it. And it's like, well, we don't actually know. Like, like we can sort of infer. And like, so much of queer history is about rumor and gossip and inference. And like, it's like grabbing these little wisps of smoke and trying to sort of create something out of them. Because that is just the nature of like queer history by definition. And so, yeah, like, I mean, I think, again, that sense of unknowability, I mean, in some ways it like offers a space for you to step in as a creative person. I mean, that's kind of interesting, but it also is very hard because it like makes you feel like there's, I think, a kind of violence in telling somebody that what has happened to them has never happened before. Like saying like the thing that you're feeling, the thing that has happened to you, the reality of your life, it is unprecedented. You are the first one. Like, that's really violent to say that to somebody. And then they feel completely alone if that's not true, And so I think that there's something really hard about this thing that we rely on, that we think of as like history being this like thing that we can sort of ride on and exist on, and like knowing that it's like this ephemeral like thing that's created by certain people that like has all these gaps in knowledge. I don't know. It's really sad. And again, part of writing the book was coming to terms with that idea and being like, that's just the reality of the situation. And I have to kind of figure out, how to talk about that in a way that feels true to me.
Was it a challenge language-wise too? Because we have the formal aspect, and I thought about, in one interview you say that the language for abused women is relatively new, and I thought, how was it a challenge? Which language you wanted to use?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, even the idea of domestic violence, like the idea that you should not like hit the person you're married to or you live with is like only about 50 years old. Like before the 70s, we generally were just sort of like, yeah, that's a thing that people do, or that men do, usually, often, right? That was like the narrative or the story. And it wasn't until, like the 70s that we began to say like, oh, like, maybe we shouldn't do that. And also there's a name for it, or like it's a thing that has like structural roots. Like it's a phenomenon, right? And so, I mean, a lot of it was also me trying to figure out like how do you put language to a thing that like before 50 years ago, which is like that's very recent. Like before that, like we didn't have a framework or a language to talk about it. We also didn't know how to talk about queer women. Like I talk in the book about how there are all these like weird examples in history where like people are sort of faced with queerness very directly and they like choose not to look at it. So like I give an example of these two women, these two Scottish schoolmistresses who were having sex and were caught having sex with each other, and the judge in like the 1800s, and the judge was like, well, there's no penis, so there's no penetration, so there's no orgasm, so there's no sex, so you're free to go. like every, you know, and it's like, literally they're looking at something and they are unable to see what is in front of them. And so, which is like, in that case, I guess, good for them, you know, but like, it's something really funny to me about how like, you know, we don't have any language, you know, prior to 50 years ago for domestic violence. We barely have language for queerness, especially with women, like, especially with two women. Like, I mean, gay men were stigmatized in a different way and there was language for that, but like women, just the idea of like a woman having sex was not even thought of as possible. Like we couldn't even like conceptualize it. So like, yeah, you're just dealing with like layers and layers of silence that you have to kind of dig through. And like, that's what I had to do, which is just like, why did I give myself that assignment? What a horrible assignment, you know? But yeah.
And with your book, you are creating in some way an archive, and your book is part of the archive as well about domestic abuse and same-sex relationship. And I wondered if you plan on work on it furthermore on this archive, or when you finish this whole book reading through Europe, you put a finish to it.
No, I'm done. Someone else can do that.
Someone else has to work on it.
Somebody else can do that. Yeah. Yeah.
But first, let's hear something from the book. We chose a part which is very hard to read, but we're always up for a challenge, like reading your book and getting challenged. Because it's a part that's referring to a children's book you might know, Choose Your Own Adventure. In German, it's 1000 Gefahren, du entscheidest selbst. The books where you could decide after a chapter where you want to go. But we will try to read it to you, but you are trying to read it so everyone will understand. Or maybe not.
I won't choose. I will do it linear.
Yeah.
Okay. Das Traumhaus als 1000 Gefahren. Du entscheidest selbst. Du wachst auf und die Luft ist milchig und hell. Das Zimmer erstrahlt in einer Art überschäumender Zufriedenheit, trotz Kisten, Klamotten und Geschirr. Du denkst dir, so dürfte jeder Morgen sein. Als du dich umdrehst, starrt sie dich an. Die schimmernde Unschuld des Lichts gerinnt dir im Magen. Du kannst dich nicht erinnern, jemals so schnell von wach auf Hab-Acht umgeschaltet zu haben. Du hast dich die ganze Nacht herumgewälzt, sagt sie. Hast deine Arme und Ellbogen auf mir abgelegt. Ich habe kein Auge zugetan. Wenn du dich überschwänglich entschuldigst, lies weiter auf Seite 225. Wenn du ihr sagst, sie soll dich das nächste Mal wecken, wenn du sie im Schlaf mit dem Ellbogen berührst, lies weiter auf Seite 226. Wenn du ihr sagst, sie soll sich beruhigen, lies weiter auf Seite 228. Tut mir echt leid, sagst du. Das war keine Absicht. Ich fuchtel einfach viel mit den Armen rum, wenn ich schlafe. Du versuchst, es locker zu nehmen. Wusstest du, dass mein Dad das auch macht? Das in Ohnmacht fallende Burgfräulein? Echt komisch. Muss ich wohl... Tut es dir wirklich leid? Fragt sie. Das nehme ich dir nämlich nicht ganz ab. Doch, sagst du. Du wünschst dir den ersten Eindruck des Morgens zurück. Die Frische, das Licht. Ehrlich. Beweis es. Wie denn? Lass es sein. Ich hab dir doch erklärt, dass das nicht geht. Fick dich, sagt sie und steht auf. Du läufst ihr bis in die Küche hinterher. Baby, wenn es wieder vorkommt, kannst du mich jederzeit wecken, dann gehe ich aufs Sofa, versprochen. Ich mache das wirklich nicht mit Absicht. Ich bekomme davon nichts mit, ich kann nicht steuern, wie ich mich im Schlaf bewege. Du bist so eine miese Fotze, sagt sie. Nie übernimmst du Verantwortung für irgendwas. Du brauchst mich doch nur zu wecken, sagst du, und wirre Verzweiflung schießt in deinen Schädel herum. Ganz einfach, weck mich auf und sag mir, dass ich mich umdrehen oder auf dem Sofa schlafen soll. Dann mache ich es, ich schwöre. Fick dich, sagt sie und steht auf. Du läufst hinter ihr her in die Küche. Da haben wir dich ja, auf einer Seite, auf der du gar nicht sein solltest. Auf dem vorgegebenen Weg kannst du nicht hier gelandet sein. Du musst also geschummelt haben. Fühlt es sich gut an, geschummelt zu haben, um hierher zu gelangen? Was bist du nur für ein Mensch? Bist du ein Monster? Ja, vielleicht bist du eins. Auf dieser Seite dürftest du gar nicht sein. Keine der Auswahlmöglichkeiten führt hierher. Du hast einfach weitergeblättert, weil du keine Lust mehr hattest, dich im Kreis zu drehen. Du wolltest ausbrechen. Du bist schlauer als ich. Frühstück. Du machst Rührei und Toast. Sie ist lustlos und lässt den Teller stehen. Räum das weg, sagt sie und geht ins Schlafzimmer, um sich umzuziehen. Wenn du gehorchst, lies weiter auf Seite 231. Wenn du ihr sagst, sie soll es selber machen, lies weiter auf Seite 228. Wenn du den schmutzigen Teller anstarrst und an nichts anderes als das feministische Idol deiner Jugend denken kannst, an Clara Barton, die sich selbst zur Krankenpflegerin ausbilden und andauernd von Männern beschimpfen und herumkommandieren lassen musste, und dich erinnerst, wie wütend du darüber warst und wie du zu deinen Eltern liefst und fragtest, ob Frauen immer noch so bevormundet würden, woraufhin deine Mutter ja sagte und dein Vater nein. Und dass du da zum ersten Mal eine Ahnung davon bekamst, wie kompliziert und schrecklich die Welt war. Lies weiter auf Seite 233. Beim Spülen denkst du, vielleicht kann ich meinen Arm irgendwie festbinden. Vielleicht kann ich mir eine Reißzwecke auf die Stirn legen. Vielleicht muss ich ein besserer Mensch werden. Du hast auf dieser Seite nichts zu suchen. Das ist bei den Auswahlmöglichkeiten, die du hattest, gar nicht möglich. Dachtest du, wenn du einfach der Reihe nach durch das Kapitel blätterst, wird es irgendwie einfacher? Raffst du es nicht? Dieser ganze Scheiß ist wirklich passiert. Und du kannst ihn nicht ungeschehen machen, auch wenn du dich noch so sehr auf den Kopf stellst. Willst du ein Bild von einem Rehkitz sehen? Würde das helfen? Na gut, hier hast du ein Rehkitz. Es ist ganz klein, getüpfelt und wackelig auf dem Bein. Es hört ein Geräusch. Er starrt und hüpft weg. Es weiß, was zu tun ist. Es weiß, dass es anderswo sicherer ist. Am Abend vögelt sie dich und du liegst stumm da und betest, dass es schnell vorbei ist, betest, dass sie nicht merkt, wie abwesend du bist. Du hast deinen Körper inzwischen so oft verlassen, dass es zur Gewohnheit geworden ist, reflexhaft wie ein Seufzen. Es erinnert dich an deinen ersten Freund, der immer Pornos schaute, während er es mit dir trieb. Er rammelte vor sich hin und griff von Zeit zu Zeit zur Fernbedienung, um etwas zurückzuspulen, das du nicht sehen konntest. Einmal recktest du den Kopf über die Bettkante und sahst ein Knäuel auf dem Kopf stehender Gliedmaßen, die dein Hirn nicht sortiert bekam. Du schautest nie wieder hin. Du lagst immer nur still da und sahst zu, wie sich sein Gesicht über dir bewegte, wie früher als Kind unter dem gähnenden Schlund des Planetariums. Die beschleunigte Umdrehung der Erde, das Wandern der Sterne, die Sternbilder, die ineinander und wieder auseinander schmolzen, während eine ferne, körperlose Stimme etwas über die Uhrzeit erzählte, um dem allen irgendeinen Sinn zu geben. Dein Zittern und Stöhnen ist fein säuberlich einstudiert. Sie macht das Licht aus. Du starrst in die Dunkelheit, bis das Dunkel verschwindet oder bis du verschwindest. Zum Einschlafen lies weiter auf Seite 237. Zum Träumen von der Vergangenheit lies weiter auf Seite 234. Zum Träumen von der Gegenwart lies weiter auf Seite 236. Zum Träumen von der Zukunft lies weiter auf Seite 235. Als es zum ersten Mal passierte, als sie dich zum ersten Mal so anschrie, dass du 30 Sekunden nach dem Aufwachen in Tränen ausbrachst, Rekord, sagte sie hinterher, die ersten 10 Minuten des Tages bin ich für nichts verantwortlich, was ich sage. Das kam dir poetisch vor. Du notiertest es dir sogar, warst sicher, es irgendwann mal verwenden zu können, vielleicht in einem Buch. Alles wird gut. Eines Tages wird deine Frau deinen Arm sanft wegschieben, wenn ihr Gesicht nachts berührt, ihn zärtlich zurechtlegen und dir einen Kuss geben. Manchmal wirst du gerade wach genug, um es mitzubekommen. Manchmal erzählt sie dir erst am nächsten Morgen davon. So dürfte jeder Morgen sein. Du sollst nicht hier sein, aber es macht nichts. Ist ja nur ein Traum. Hier kann sie dich nicht finden. Gleich wachst du auf und alles wirkt wie immer. Aber das ist es nicht. Es gibt einen Weg hier raus. Hörst du mir zu? Das darfst du nicht vergessen, wenn du aufwachst. Du darfst es nicht. Du wachst auf. Und die Luft ist milchig und hell. Das Zimmer erstrahlt in einer Art überschäumender Zufriedenheit, trotz Kisten, Klamotten und Geschirr. Du denkst dir, so dürfte jeder Morgen sein. Als du dich umdrehst, starrt sie dich an. Die schimmernde Unschuld des Lichts gerinnt dir im Magen. Du kannst dich nicht erinnern, jemals so schnell von wach auf 7:30 umgeschaltet zu haben. Du hast dich die ganze Nacht herumgewälzt, sagt sie. Hast deine Arme und Ellbogen auf mir abgelegt. Ich habe kein Auge zugetan. Wenn du dich überschwänglich entschuldigst, lies weiter auf Seite 225. Wenn du ihr sagst, sie soll dich das nächste Mal wecken, wenn du sie im Schlaf mit dem Ellbogen berührst, lies weiter auf Seite 226. Wenn du die Decke zurückschlägst, aus dem Bett springst und durchs Haus sprintest, als wärst du in Pamplona, wenn du den Autoschlüssel schon in der Einfahrt parat hast und mit dramatisch quietschenden Reifen davonfährst, um nie zurückzukehren, lies weiter auf Seite 238. So ist es zwar nicht gewesen, aber gut. Wir können ruhig so tun. Ich lasse es dir durchgehen. Ausnahmsweise.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you two more questions, but the audience can brace themselves to maybe ask a question. Take the chance when you hear to ask Carmen about her book or writing or, I don't know, whatever comes to your mind. I read in an interview with you that there's something about houses or architecture that fascinates you, and now the book is called In the Dream House, not in the German title, but you're talking about architecture and houses as well. What is it about the house that isn't a home? And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's so funny. I was doing a German interview yesterday, and I was talking about how this only works with a German audience. But I'm very interested in the uncanny unheimlich. But I'm not sure. I'm not saying that correctly. But the idea of unhomeliness, right? Like the idea of like something that is uncanny, is unfamiliar in the specific kind of way. And I have always found there to be something very specifically interesting about the way in which, architecture, creates clusters of people. It's sort of these centers that sort of move through time. And, like I live in a house, the house I'm in right now is over 100 years old. And so there's like, so much history and stuff like, sort of running through it. And I exist here and many people have existed here. And I always think about, who existed in the space before I did and who will exist after, and how we are just, there's ghosts, and then we are pre-ghosts. Right now everyone in that room is a pre-ghost, and one day somebody might walk over that space and like maybe get a little bit of you, And so I'm just very fascinated by sort of the home, and then also the way that the home or a house or a space, intersects with gender. You think about the Gothic, it's about a woman in a hostile space, like a woman in a hostile architecture. And so I feel like so much of, thinking about gender in this way and thinking about, domesticity and where women belong and, the women's domains, like, and then you think about, so there's something very profoundly provocative and haunted about basically all spaces. And I just feel like there's just such a natural sort of set of metaphors in there that I just always find myself exploring in my fiction and my nonfiction, everything I do. I just feel like I return to it a lot. So it makes sense that it became like the center of this book.
And it's like in the book, it's like this cabin in the woods where you can't hear a thing when someone screams. And there's maybe I don't know how to tell in English, like a reflective moment later in the book where you hear someone scream from afar, but you don't do anything. Like you hear that there's something going on, but you don't do anything. Was that some kind of, did you want to tell also that you had like people around you who didn't do anything to maybe help you or get you out of it?
I mean, this is another one of those unanswerable questions, right? Which is, you know, what are our responsibilities to each other? What do we, you know, how, you know, in many ways, like the people in my life, you know, really helped me when I was sort of trying to claw my way out. And, you know, I write about a lot of people who helped me kind of ask really important questions. And yeah, I don't know, I guess I think a lot about, you know, what we sort of think of as acceptable or not acceptable, and the ways in which, I don't know if this concept exists in German, but there's this idea that I'll never forget from this sex blogger I used to follow a million years ago. And they would talk about the empty stare or the missing stare. So this idea that like, if you go to a house party and there's like, you know, a stair missing in the stairs and somebody like falls through, and then everyone says, oh, sorry, we meant to mention that, but like, yeah, there's like the stair missing. So it's like this thing that we know about that's not good, but like nobody thinks to ever explain it to the new person. Everyone just sort of kind of just like collectively agrees to not really think about this thing, right? And so this idea of like, you know, and this can apply to all kinds of ideas, but I think there's something about like being like, you know, we accept on some level that like certain bad behavior will happen. I mean, even in the queer community, like there's this sort of idea of like dyke drama, you know, it's like, oh, they're just having one of those kinds of fights. And we sort of like manage to kind of smooth over or like skip over the part where like we actually need to be like concerned. And so I feel like, yeah, like I'm sort of touching on a lot of these ideas, but ultimately there's no answer, right? Like ultimately it's like, well, it didn't happen. I think about it a lot, you know, I've thought about it, you know, I've had to like give that advice to other people. Like it's this very sort of strange dynamic that is, you know, really hard to explain, but yeah, I don't know. So
the audience can just give me like a little sign if they want to ask something. Talking about responsibility, there's the topic of representation you reflect on in the book, of queer representation, and how that may be, how certain narratives establish problematic representation. Did this accompany your, how strong did this accompany your writing? Did you choose to leave some stories out, or did you at one point say, fuck it, I write whatever I want?
Oh, definitely I said fuck it a lot, and I just did it. Yeah, no, I didn't leave anything out as far as I can remember where I had that concern. I mean, certainly the idea about, you know, what does it mean to sort of air a community's dirty laundry, to talk about like a thing that we don't talk about normally. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Like that is obviously something that I, you know, was very like on my mind writing the book. But I ultimately decided to just write the book I wanted to write, because I was afraid that if I tried to if I got too in my head about, you know, what one person would say versus another, I was like, I'll never write again. You know, like ultimately I have to write the book that I need to write, that like it reflects my understanding of the world, and like everything else I sort of want to just put to the side. So.
Okay, I scroll through the audience. Does anyone want to ask a question to Carmen? Once in a lifetime chance to ask Carmen a question. Since you don't come to Germany, maybe soon, maybe in the future. We have one question for you.
Okay. I hope you can hear me. I have to apologize in advance, because it's often at events like this, people pretend to ask questions, but then it's not really a question. I will do this now as well. But it's something that I found remarkable in this what Victoria read about this game where you can choose the page, and then there are these pages which you're not supposed to read, or which you are not supposed to write as well. And I found this very interesting because like you read this book and have the feeling there's a narrator who like writes this down and it's your place and you decide what's in it. But then all of a sudden there's like another voice coming up and facing against you. And it also kind of like, afterwards you spoke about architecture and about the uncanny house, etc. And also reminded me of like the book as a house, like which has rooms where you want to hide, but eventually you're not allowed to enter them or something like that. So yeah, it's not really a question. I apologize, but maybe maybe you could say something about this as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation. I mean, I think there is something about, you know, the book as the house, the book as the architecture, like the book as the you know, the building with many rooms, and there are some that you shouldn't go into. I mean, I think that's all very astute. I mean, on some level, you know, it's so funny when people talk to me about my books and about what they've read in my books, because, you know, so much of writing is unknown to you. Like, so many of the books that I write are unknown to me in many profound ways, you know, and a lot of times people sort of make observations about it. And it's not that I'm like, I think that the text completely bears that reading. And also I was not thinking about that even slightly, you know, and I think that so much of it is about, you know, in many ways, this book is a map of my subconscious and a map of like this sort of moment of my life. And I think that, yeah, there's something really interesting about how, in a way, it's like there's a ghost haunting the house of the book and me as a result. You know, there's like something that exists in there that, yeah. So yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I think, yeah.
Hi, Carmen. I really enjoyed being gaslit by your book, by the way. I've decided to stick to books for now, so it's better. I wanted to ask you if you think that now you would know better how to deal or what to say to a friend who is in a dream house.
Mm-hmm. I think yes and no. I think yes, in the sense that, you know, I wonder if it has less to do with my own experience and the book and more about getting a little older, in that my tolerance for bullshit is significantly lower than it was when I was 24. And so I feel like I have given a lot of advice and talked to people through things. And, you know, because I do feel like part of the book is about, God forbid, being 24, you know, and just like not knowing sort of so many things you don't know. And then, you know, and also I'm in my 30s and like, I know there's things that I don't know. And like, I mean, et cetera, like that goes on. But I think also there is something like sort of fundamentally really difficult about these kinds of relationships where like, also if people aren't telling you things, it's very hard to often like kind of parse like what exactly you're looking at. And I found this to be true even now. You know, I actually recently just had this experience where like a situation that I did not realize was going on. And I remember feeling very taken aback because I was like, I did not get that vibe at all. Like I was very surprised. And so even, you know, having like written this book and like gone through it myself and like you know, I was still surprised, and there was still, you know, something very sort of scary about like what I didn't know and what I hadn't seen. And so I think part of it is that essentially you are sort of talking about something that is by sort of slippery by definition. Like it's a thing that's really hard to pin down. And if somebody feels like they can't talk about it or they, you know, don't have the language for it, then you are dealing with a situation where it's actually like hard to even begin to try to approach it, and like understand it and like talk someone through it. But yeah, I mean, I like to think that I am able to, or I would be able to, but also there's something really paralyzing about it. I mean, I remember, you know, like after the book came out, my spouse and I were at a club, and we went to like a gay club that had a lesbian night, and we were in line to go to this club, and there were these two women behind us having this horrific fight, like horrific. And it was so upsetting that we had to leave. Like it was so, and it like went on and on and on. And like one woman they called a cab, and then she tried to get into the cab. The other one pulled her out of the cab. Like there was just this like And I remember and I mean, again, these are not people that I knew, they were strangers, but like, I remember just feeling like completely paralyzed and trapped. And like, my response was to run, that was my response. And so like, I also like, don't think that like writing the book makes me like necessarily any better at this sort of thing. There is something I think ultimately really hard about it. And, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to think that the writing of the book was partially me trying to like give people those tools and like trying to like I hate the phrase raise awareness. This just sounds like I'm trying to save a seal or something, but like, like I feel like hopefully that's part of it too, is like, showing people kind of like what these can look like and hopefully giving them the tools. So I don't know.
Could you maybe repeat the last sentence you said? We couldn't.
Oh, sorry. I don't remember the last sentence I said. What did I say? I'm sorry. I just blank out when I talk and I don't remember anything that just came out of my mouth. Yeah, that maybe the book gives people tools, I guess, to help. And, that's the part that I could do, was give people like language, or try to begin to give them language for their experiences.
Thank you.
Hi. I found it really interesting when you were talking about how the form of the memoir came together. And I was just wondering, with your fiction, because so many of your short stories feel so dense, and particularly thinking about something like The Husband's Stitch, where there are so many fables and legends referenced and kind of woven into the story. I was just really interested in your process for starting something, and how much you have to think through and plan before you start writing, and how much you find that as you're going.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it sort of depends, which is the most annoying answer I could possibly give. Like, it depends on the story. In many ways, I often start. Some writers will say, oh, a character spoke to me. That never happens for me. It's always like a concept or a question or an idea. So it'll be me being like, I want to retell this urban legend, or I want to write a demonic possession story, or I'm really interested in like Law and Order SVU, like episode capsule descriptions. Or I want to write a story where it's set in at a residency, like in the woods. It's always like very sort of concept-y. And then I feel like the heart of the story, the characters, like the emotional sort of underpinnings, the muscle kind of comes later. Like, it's sort of as I begin to sort of think about, begin to like kind of write it out and play, like things begin to kind of take shape. So I'm definitely like a concept forward writer. I don't do a ton of planning. Some writers I know are very like, they'll do outlines and they're very like meticulous in that way. And I feel like for me, I mean, writing fiction, I suppose, I guess with nonfiction is sort of a different situation. With fiction, I feel like, every time you sit down to write, it's like you're going on a little adventure, and like, you don't know what you're going to find. And so I'm more interested in like sort of sitting down and being like, what's my brain going to do today? As opposed to like sitting down and like pounding through like an outline and trying to, I just am a little more kind of free form, I guess. And then at some point, when a story begins to take shape, like when a story begins to actually sort of resemble a story as opposed to like a series of paragraphs or scenes or thoughts or whatever I've written, when I get to that point, then I'll be like, okay, now I want to like stitch it all together. Now I need to make sure it kind of has a shape. But I feel like, I'm pretty just like fly by the seat of my pants, like, sort of write whatever strikes me. And I'm also very like a write as the spirit moves me person. So I don't write every day. I know a lot of writers, some writers do, and people talk about that as like a thing that writers do, but I don't write for weeks and then I'll write like a ton in like 2 or 3 days. Like, I'm just one of those people. It's just how my brain works. I can't really account for it, but yeah, no, I mean, for me, it's like starting from a concept or form, or like being like, oh, I want to try a story that's the shape of a Kickstarter or whatever. So definitely for me, it's more conceptual, and then everything else comes later.
Thanks. Yeah, it was really interesting to hear all your thoughts about this. I really loved the book. I was wondering how you balance, you kind of touched on this already, but kind of balance the narrative and the like analytical parts. Because I feel like sometimes analysis can be a way, and maybe emotional processing is not the same exact process as writing a book, but can be a way of like distancing yourself. But it can also be a way of like analysis and research can be a way of feeling or thinking through it. And I wonder how that was in the process. So that's a similar question, or how that played into thinking about how you built the book. And I'm also now thinking about what you were saying before about giving the reader and yourself a break with changes in form, and whether that played a role here. Like, oh, here's some analysis. You don't have to feel right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I definitely think that research in general can be very intoxicating. I think this is true across genres, because it does permit you're like, I'm doing work, but you're like not really doing, like you're reading and you're like thinking, but you're not actually sitting down to write. And I think that's very tempting in a lot of ways when you're like avoiding what you want to be avoiding. And so I think in that way, certainly that's true. I think in the case of this book, because the research was so sad, like I don't know what was worse. Like, I don't know if it was worse to write about my own stuff or to like read like decades of like heart-wrenching like personal accounts of like lesbians being beaten by their girlfriends. Like, both of those are pretty bad. Like, and I feel like I was, and I sort of did all the research in one chunk too. Like, I sort of did it, like I literally blocked off like almost like a month, and I was just basically, I was almost exclusively doing research, like making notes, and then occasionally I would like make a connection and like write a little bit or like put it all together. But like, I was doing it sort of all in one discrete piece, which I don't know why. I mean, like, this is the first time I've ever done anything like this before, so I don't know if that's like my process or that's just like what I did, because I didn't know what else to do. But yeah, and then I think, it was important to like kind of spread it out throughout the book. Like, I wanted it, the argument to kind of like, build on itself. And like, I didn't want there to be just like, because when I wrote it, like, it was just research for like 40 pages. And I was like, obviously this is very boring. Like, nobody's going to read like 40, this, in the middle of this, like, otherwise very like personal sort of thing. And so, yeah, I had to kind of figure out how to like spread them out. And I mean, again, my editor really helped me by like helping me kind of move pieces around and figure out what the order was. But yeah, I definitely had to spread that out, because it was such a specific and intense process. And, I mean, it was like, I don't think I like used it as an avoidance technique, because it was pretty difficult, though I think that is a thing people do. But yeah, like I did have to like figure out a way to like make it not feel dry. And also, this was the other hard thing, was like, I had never written from research. So like, I would read the sections that I had written that were like personal, and they would have this, flow to them. There'd be this like sort of, the sentence would have this like momentum, which is just like my sentences that I write. And then I would get to like the parts where it was just like, in 1895, like, blah, blah, and it would just go like, and it would just die. And I was like, oh my God, this is so bad. I have to fix it. And I would just be like sitting there, like trying to figure out like how to make a sentence that includes facts that I cannot control. Like that isn't personal, like how to make that like work. And that was like really hard. Like I feel like I spent a lot of time just like trying to fix or trying to make those parts not feel like deadly boring. I mean, excuse me. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but that was what I was trying to do. So yeah, that was my process, I guess. I don't know. But like I said, I didn't know what I was doing. I was really making it up as I went along. Like, yeah.
Yeah, with the timetable in mind, maybe I asked the last question I have to ask. What are you working on right now, and when will we read it?
I am working on a bunch of things right now. I'm working on some TV, which is exciting, which I can't really talk about, but I will tell you, I'll give you that little nibble. So I'm doing that. And I'm also working on a new book, which is a series of linked stories that I don't know when it will come out, because deadlines are not real, and I've blown past 2 of them already. So who knows? But I am writing a new book of fiction. Yeah.
Exciting. Maybe we will see you in person in Germany. Who knows?
Fingers crossed.
We
I would
would be
love
ready.
that.
I want to thank the audience for coming to She Said. I want to thank everyone watching online. I want to thank you for reading so beautifully. It was very nice listening to you. Thank you to She Said for hosting this event. Thank you to Tropen for making it all happen. And of course, thank you, Carmen Maria Machado. Thank you for being with us and talking with us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you to everyone and have a good evening, I would say.
Thank you everyone for coming.
So, Carmen, I would say...
I just go.